Today, it's an interesting thing, and it's a question that's been asked forever, but still is being asked today. And that is, who is my neighbor? We find a lot of things about, loving your neighbor, helping your neighbor, blessing your neighbor, but who really is the neighbor? Or who is the person that I need to kind of take out of that equation? Is the neighbor my family? Is it my friends? Is it the people that I work with? Is it the people down the street? What really is a neighbor? It's interesting. People don't know what it is. It could be everyone, and I can't even really tell what all of that means. All I know is that it's more encompassing than you and I think. And it's probably not the unlovable or the unlovables of this life or the despicables. It's not those people that I need to love, that I actually despise. I tend to think that they are the closest people in proximity to us. Who are the people that are really the closest to us, and how am I treating the people that are near, not just the people that are far away? It's really funny how the people that want to become missionaries, kind of in their next career move, they want to become missionaries, but still at the same time, they don't even know the person who lives next door. Or they are willing to kiss their dogs, but still they would never even think about hugging their parents. Now, I've got some thoughts about neighbors, some interesting thoughts, and I think that you might like them as well. And the first one is, what's the greatest commandment? The commandment that God gives to us. It's not someone pointing their finger in your face, but what is the largest or the overarching issue about God and what He desires for us in life? In Matthew chapter 22, beginning with verse 37, it says, Jesus answered after He was asked the question about what's the greatest commandment. Jesus answered and said, now love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and the most important commandment. He said the second's like it. He said, now love your neighbor as yourself. Now, all of Moses' teachings, he said, and the prophets' teachings depend on these two commandments. So loving your neighbor, the first and the greatest commandment, or actually loving the Lord, the first and greatest commandments, but the second commandment is just like it. And he said, now love your neighbor as yourself. Here's another thought about neighbors as well, and that is, what does a real neighbor do? If I'm going to be someone's neighbor, what do I need to do? If you're going to be someone's neighbor, what do you do? What kind of things have you done to the people that are near you, to your employer, to your spouse, to your kids, to your friends? What kind of things have you done? Now, we know in Luke chapter 10, there was the story of what we call the Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan, actually, he had the priest looked and saw what was going on with the Samaritan. He went over to the other side of the street, and a Levi, he did the very same thing. He just took off. But then there was a Samaritan that came in and put the man on his donkey and took him over to the hotel, the local hotel, and left him there and paid the innkeeper and said, if he spends anything else until I return, he said, I will pay for it when I get back. So Jesus said in Luke chapter 10, verse 36, he said, of these three men, he said, who do you think was a neighbor to the man who was attacked by robbers? So Jesus asked the question, who was the neighbor? So the expert said, the one who was kind enough to help him. He was the one that was his neighbor. Jesus told him, he said, now you go and you do likewise. The one that would help him, the one that would love him, the one that didn't even know him, but yet at the same time was willing to be able to lend a hand. The next thought that I have about neighbors and who is my neighbor is that you're smart. Well, you mean this is one of your thoughts? It is. You're smart and you know what to do. You know exactly what to do. It's born on the inside of you. You have to say no to it just to be able to go on. But really, you know what to do. You do. James chapter 4, verse number 17. James said this, in fact, if you know the right thing to do and you don't do it, he said, for you, this is evil. If you know the right thing to do, because you're smart, you really are, but you don't do it, then it's evil. You know what to do. And it brings displeasure to God that he has actually placed you and I here on the earth, while at the same time, we don't act as he would act with someone. Now that's what God has called us to do. To be just like him when it comes to other people. Well, what about another thought about neighbors, how I treat them and what part that they need to play in my life? The fourth thing is that if you have enough, if you've got enough in life, here's what you do with the rest. In 1 John chapter 3, verse number 17, the Bible tells us, he said, but if anyone has enough money to live well and sees a brother or sister in need and refuses to help, how can God's love be in that person? Like if you've got enough for what you owe and something left over, then how does God's love dwell in you if in fact that you're not willing to be able to help that person? You see, I know for me is that I want to help every person that I possibly can. Now, whether that's right or wrong, I don't really know, but one thing I do know is this, is I would rather have God blame me for helping too much than for not helping enough. I would rather that. Here's another thought about neighbors, and that is, here's what you do no matter how bad a neighbor acts. Well, I'm going to do to them what they did to me. No, wait a minute, that isn't the way that this goes. It's not the way you and I should respond. In Leviticus chapter 19, verse number 18, the Bible tells us, he said, now don't seek revenge or carry a grudge against any of your people. He said, now love your neighbor as yourself. He said, for I am God. He said, don't seek revenge and don't hold a grudge against any person. How do you sound when you talk about other people? What comes out of your mouth? What kind of things do you let run through your mind when it comes to others? He said, now, don't ever seek revenge and don't hold a grudge against anyone, because he is the Lord our God. So I know if I've got enough, I need to help. Who then is my neighbor? I don't even need to know the person. What I need to do is I just need to be able to help. In Matthew chapter 5, verse number 44, speaking about what you do no matter how a neighbor acts toward you. Verse 44, Jesus said, I'm challenging that. He said, I'm telling you to love your enemies. Remember, he said, right before that, he said, now, you heard it said that you were to love your friends and hate your enemies. He said, but I'm telling you. He said, I'm telling you to love your enemies. He said, let them bring the best out in you, not the worst. When someone gives you a hard time, respond with the energies of prayer. When they're giving you a tough time, just pray for them. He said, for then you're working out your true selves. He said, your God-created selves. He said, this is what God does. This is exactly what God does. And he gives his best. He said, the sun to warm and the rain to nourish. He said, to everyone regardless. the good and the bad, the nice and even the nasty. That's what he does. In Romans chapter 12, we find that the Apostle Paul even mentions something like this about our neighbors. He said, now don't insist on getting even. He said, because that's not for you to do. Don't insist. You don't get even. You let God get even. He said, don't get even. He said, because that's not for you to do. God said, I'll do the judging. He said, I'll take care of it. In Romans 12:20, he said, our scriptures tell us that if you see your enemy hungry, go buy that person lunch. Or if he's thirsty, give him something to drink. You know, what's really sad about all of this is that many times in life, this doesn't come on a person until they get older. Because you find out that in life, you don't really ever need to sweat the small stuff. People never really meant to be mean. They just didn't have a way out. And they thought that the only way out that they could possibly find was to do some things that were wrong. What's another thought about neighbors? Is that pleasing others, our neighbors, pleasing others is the call that God has placed upon our lives. Just pleasing others. In Romans chapter 15, verse number 2, the Bible tells us each of us should please his neighbor for his good, to build him up. Each of us should please his neighbor for his good so that we can build him up. Remember, in life, the only thing that's necessary is building someone else up, not tearing them down, not speaking negatively to them, not saying things that you really don't want to say, but building someone else up. You know, Paul never qualified that statement in Romans chapter 15. What he said was, he said, now we need to please our neighbors for their good, to build them up. So he never qualified it by saying, well, if they're Christians, then I'll treat them well. Really, because it seems as though to me that Christians treat each other more difficultly than they would even treat the person that hated them horribly. But always remember that as you go to be able to speak into the lives of others, to please people, your spouse, your boss, your kids, your friends, as you go to be able to please them, that very same thing is pleasing God. I want to please God. And if it takes me pleasing you in order to be able to please God, that's exactly what I'm going to do. And then, lastly, about a thought about a neighbor. Who's my neighbor? Always remember the royal law, because the royal law is the one that's so important. In James chapter 2, verse number 8, James said this, if you keep the royal law found in Scripture, love your neighbor as yourself, he said, you'll do very well. If you learn how to love people in life, you're going to do really, really well. Because there's no qualification on loving our neighbors as ourselves. If they're believers, no, not really if they're believers, but actually, even if they're not, we're going to love them regardless of whether they believe in the same God that we believe in or they don't. We're going to please them. We're going to love them. Remember that the only time that you ever look down upon anyone or anything is when you're willing to bend over and to pick it up. Don't ever look down on another person unless you're willing to bend over and pick them up. So, the question remains, how can I be a good neighbor? Here's a few things. observe, and respect other people's space. Respect other people's space. Give people space. Stay out of their no-fly zone. Stay out of it. The next thing is this. If you have an issue with someone, go directly to them. Don't talk about them, but go directly to them and get things fixed up. The third thing is, if you want to be a good neighbor, always give people the benefit of the doubt. If there is any doubt in it, give the benefit to someone else. God's going to take care of you, but you're never really convinced of the fact that He's going to take care of them. The next thing is, if you have a neighbor, just make them feel important. Make other people feel very important in life. That is so, so important. And then lastly, in order for me to be a good neighbor, I need to be willing to invite others into my world. To give up all of the selfishness about my life, my time, and the situations that I have. And that about wraps it up. It's a neighbor. Who is my neighbor? Virtually, it seems like everyone outside of ourselves is our neighbor. It's not just our family, friends, co-workers, kids. It's not that. It's really everyone. When Jesus spoke about a neighbor, He spoke about giving everyone in life your best. Because He gave you His best. And now you can give your best to others. How do you start that? You start that by a relationship with God. Do you personally have a relationship with the Lord? Have you become a son or a daughter of God by believing that Jesus Christ paid the price for you? That's a question. Can you answer that? You know, if you've never made Jesus Christ the Lord of your life, then today's your day. Well, how do I do that? It's very simple. And it's just a very, very simple prayer by saying, Jesus Christ, I'm asking for the forgiveness that you brought to be placed on my account. I make you the Lord of my life, and I believe in my heart God has raised you from the dead. When you do that, the Bible says that you are born again. God's going to invade your life with His presence and with His love. So always remember to hold on to that.